Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Album Musings. So before we get into this episode's album that I want to talk about, that I want to muse over, I want to do my meditation on music discovery bit. Because really this is what these episodes are about. It's about me thinking about an album that maybe I've recently listened to or listened to again, and reflecting on how I discovered it and what I didn't discover. So there's a lot of things about, the whole phenomenon of being blindsided by a particular band or a style of music or an album. So I thought I'd bring up this album discovery grid. I wanted to sort of try and get some sort of concrete grasp on this. I have something on the screen to talk about how I tend to think about how I discover music. So there's 4 quadrants in this. It borrows, pretty much from the whole concept of Johari window, where you've got 2 dimensions, and in this one it's what are you aware of in terms of your music environment, and what did you listen to ultimately or not listen to. So the 4 quadrants are aware of, so it's being aware of an album and then listening to it, or being aware of an album and then for whatever reason not listening to it, being not aware of an album but then listening to it, and we'll talk about how these manifest themselves or how they have to me individually. And then finally this last category, not being aware of an album and then not listening to it. So how do you not be aware of an album and then listen to it? Well, we'll start with this one. So things that fall into this category for me, 2 albums spring to mind, and for different reasons or different scenarios. One is the second album by Jellyfish. So was it Spilt Milk? So I was not aware of Jellyfish in any form up to the point of hearing that album. And what happened was I was meeting up with a group of friends just to hang out around someone's house in a really nice conservatory on a nice evening, I think probably during summer, and we were just hanging out talking about music, and it turned into a music listening party because the person whose house it was worked at or was working at, amongst probably several jobs, was working at I think a Virgin Megastore. And so they used to get, staff prices on albums. And so they had a couple of albums. One was the latest album at the time by New Order, which was in Republic, which I did know about. I was a big New Order fan. But the Jellyfish album. So at that point, I just listened to the whole album. So that's one example of that sort of album that falls into that category. Of course, now I am, and of course this is a movement thing, so that album has sort of moved now from this to this over time because of that event. Another example is the album by Ministry, and I always can never remember the name. I think it was also called something like How to Succeed or How to Suck Eggs. I think, wasn't it called, maybe the album was called Jehovah as well? But it's the one with Just One Fix on it and New World Order. And so what happened there was I was in Brighton, funnily enough, in a megastore, not the place where this friend of mine worked. But I was down there one weekend, probably on a Sunday. This would have been way back in the 80s, I suspect, yeah. And this track came on the internal hi-fi, where they're just playing music all the time. And I thought, that sounds like a cool track. And I'm trying to remember if I was into industrial at that point. I probably think the only band I would have been aware of, I'm trying to think how deep into the 9 Inch Nails catalogue I would have been at that point, if at all. I'm just trying to think because I more got into them around the time of Broken and Fixed, and then Downward Spiral, which I think Downward Spiral was probably a little bit later. But I was probably into like slightly hard, darker sounding Depeche Mode, and Oh, who else really? I'm just trying to think. Was I listening to SPK at that point? I'm not sure. Anyway, probably beside the point. But yeah, so not really the world of that, whatever wave of industrial music was that had been influenced, and initially by the pioneers, but then some of the electronic bands that weren't necessarily industrial, but had an influence. And if you listen to any early Ministry, you'll see they have their own development from what they became originally, from more of almost like an electro pop band, from the really early stuff into that much harder metallic industrial sound. And yeah, it just came on there. I went up, asked what it was. They said, "Oh, it's this new album by Ministry." Never heard of Ministry, but I said, "Oh, I'll have one of those." So I bought it on cassette, and it went just straight. At that point, pretty much the last shops I'd visit in Brighton when I went down on a Sunday morning would be there used to be two big record stores at the end as you walk between Brighton and Hove, and as you get sort of before Brighton merges into Hove, there was a Virgin and a, was it Our Price? No, HMV, that's it, HM. There was also an Our Price down there at one point. In fact, there were two HMVs in Brighton at one point. Anyway, it was there was an HMV and a Virgin Megastore across from each other. And so I'd always go in them last before I then went and drove back. And so, yeah, I literally went in there, got it, and went back to the car and played it. So it was another one of, here's a band I'm not aware of, just discovered them through hearing it on the radio and gone out and just bought albums straight away. And then there's albums where there was quite either a delay, or I still haven't listened to this day. So there's quite a lot of like post Britpop bands who I'm aware of their back catalogue but haven't really got around to listening to them. I was trying to think of a good example of, I suppose last week, to some degree over that year or so where I didn't listen to them. Stone Roses, I was aware of them, didn't listen to them for quite a while, but then I did, and it's a movement from here to here, and as I said with the other one, from here to here. And more, I'm just trying to think of one where there's been a real big gap. I suppose bands like Alterbridge, who I was aware of, and it was many, many years before I listened to anything by them. And some of the post-rock bands that I became aware of off the back of listening to Explosions in the Sky, probably fall into that category where I was aware of them. And of course, this category, this tends to happen a lot. It used to happen a lot more in I would say, streaming, although it still happens to me now. I just, there's not enough hours in the day for me to listen to music as much as I would want to. But yeah, certainly, when you had to go out and buy stuff, there was a financial decision there in a lot of this. Or maybe you just didn't feel like checking the band out at that point. But certainly it was something that it was more apparent to me, and that was more likely to happen in the days where, there wasn't a streaming service. We're going to talk a little bit about streaming at the end as well, and music discovery in 2007, because this is the year where this album I'm going to be talking about comes from. And then we've got this category here, not aware of, didn't listen to. And this is really, when I do these series going forward for Album Musings, probably the albums I'm going to talk about are going to fall into one of these two categories of albums that I was aware of and then didn't listen to until a number of years. So a good example of that is, things like Portishead albums, another one actually. I was aware of them, but for financial reasons, didn't listen to for quite a number of years. And then this week's album, which I'm going to talk about, which is a Bloc Party album, totally not aware of them at all. I'm pretty sure. Obviously I might have inadvertently listened to them osmotically over the years, but yeah, not really aware of them. Didn't listen to them until recording this episode when I was trying to pick a year. So with that rather long preamble over, so what I'm doing currently is I'm looking at years, favourite years in music, but asking myself, what did I miss? Or what albums were slow burners for me, mainly because, something delayed my purchase. So I think going forward, two categories of albums I'm going to talk about that fall into albums that took me a while to pick up on, or albums that I never picked up on until I started looking at the year in preparation for this episode. So I'm pretty much going to go in cold when I put these episodes together and just get a bit of an overview and try and pick an album fairly quickly so it's still going to be fresh for me, and it has that sort of almost like streaming feel where I'm actually streaming this live, but just without the chat, I suppose, the two-way chat. So yeah, A Weekend in the City. So this came out in 2007. I actually have a spreadsheet I use to help me with this, which is it takes data from best ever albums, and at some point I will get around to uploading this to my GitHub and including a link in these episodes going forward. But I need to play around with the spreadsheet a little bit. It's in its early days, and I've got some filtering in there and some slicing, but there's a few other features I wouldn't mind having, and I think I'll fix that before I sort of release it to the general public. It might even be out there already and I didn't really notice, but I'm going to have a poke around my GitHub account this afternoon and see what is up there and what isn't. The raw data's actually up there, but the spreadsheet, so a CSV of this is up there, but the spreadsheet for best albums ever is not, with the pivot table. So yeah, Bloc Party. So this was their second album. So what does it say? 2006, released in 2007. And yeah, we'll look at the chart entry in a moment. This is pretty crazy. This went in at number 2 in the UK albums charts. And we're sitting in a period here where we're on the cusp of getting into, what would you call it, like legal streaming services. So I'm assuming there's still like ones kicking around, which are either definitely running into copyright and all sorts of legal issues, or are sort of skating a weird area to do with online upload of files and data storage and online storage of music, and people deliberately sort of not locking their music collections down, that sort of thing, through services, media storage services where you just upload it but then you don't lock the account down. And there's a sort of music sharing that evolved out of that as well. And I suppose we then move into, what is it, BitTorrent territory as well around then as well, which had been around for a while, but yeah, certainly is interesting period. So 2007, we were definitely seeing the birth of things like Spotify, and we'll talk about that later. So it was, we'll look at the lineup as well as this band. So yeah, it was included on 1,000 albums to hear before you die, but it was the Guardian list. I don't see a link to that actually. The album before that was Silent Alarm. We'll have a bit of a poke around at their albums as well and see how generally they did. So yeah, I've been listening to a lot this week. I sort of created this 2007 playlist of UK artists that had, an album out in 2007, and have been working my way through that. And that was created or inspired from the Best Ever Albums CSV that I've aggregated to help me do this in my aforementioned spreadsheet. It's interesting. It says band worked by setting up all instruments with only a single power amplifier. Wow. It's funny. Now it's funny how a lot of stuff now is much better quality, more affordable. I'm thinking about guitars and instruments here, particularly guitars. Like you can get a really good guitar and amplifier fairly cheaply compared to what it was like in the 80s, 70s, 80s or 80s whenever I learned. And so what the go-to thing back then, and what's making me smile, is often you'd go out, you'd buy this really awful guitar because it's all you could afford, and you couldn't afford an amp. So there's all sorts of stories littered through musicians' history of them like wiring it into their dad's stereo, or I think there's that whole story about New Order of Hookie and Bernard Sumner wiring their bass and their guitar into their grand's stereo, I think, through the cartridge on the record player. Certainly, it's funny, I had a quite a nice radio, like a multi-band radio, which had a 5-pin DIN-in on it. I don't know if anybody remembers those, but I bought this converter to take it from that to like the sort of jack that you'd use on a guitar, and so I was able to plug my guitar into that and use that for quite a while actually before I could afford to buy an amplifier. But yeah, it's funny talking about through a single power amplifier. And it's interesting when you do that. Like, I remember going out and buying one of those little battery practice amps, like really cheap ones off of Maplin in the UK. So what would that be? Radio Shack in North America, I suppose. And playing around with that. And there was always this sweet spot on it when the batteries had started to run out, where you got this really cool distortion on that. So it's funny when I read this, and I've just read this, and it sort of brought back memories of that. Oh, you mentioned a Pro Tools. 2007, somewhere around there. I remember going around to a friend's house, and they had quite a nice 4-track unit that recorded to tape at double speed, which I'd had one years previous, and I'd sort of it started to go wrong. One of the channels had gone wrong, and then I'd sort of lent it out to a friend but didn't really want it back. They were using it as a mixing desk, and they got more use out of it than I did. But I had another friend who had one, and it had effects on it, and it got me thinking about that. And I remember being aware of how reasonable like 8-track recorders were that used hard drives on them at that point. There was a Zoom recorder out at that point, which was pretty nice. It also had a CD player in it as well. So yeah, it's 2007 was a really interesting time for recording because of things like Pro Tools, and also hardware devices coming down quite a bit as well. And the appearance of, I don't know how long the Pod XT had been out at that point, but you had things like virtual effects, and being able to tap into like massive amounts of gear that normally you'd need. With the Pod XT device, you had something where you've got, I was used to say it was like having an Arctic tractor trailer, full of gear, like a lorry full of gear in like a footprint that's about the size or less than the size of a shoebox. Amps and cabs and effects and all sorts of things. And also this whole thing about that time, you were getting stuff that was being leaked online, but because of bandwidth issues and various other things, often it was of reasonably low quality sometimes, and then we got a high quality version being leaked. But yeah, I remember that being a thing. But yeah, if you haven't listened to this, then you're well worth a listen. Okay, so this name is one I've come up before. So I'm pretty sure when I did my Year of Brian Eno, didn't I mention this artist in that? Because of her association with the fact that her artwork, or photograph should I say, was used on this album. Okay, so they also used it. That's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, actually, is artists that, do covers. There's the guy from what are they called now? Oh, the albums are all like Blue Album, Purple Album. Guys, I've actually seen them live. I saw them supporting, it was joint support. They alternated with them and Deaf Heaven, and that was. Oh, I've really gone off on a side tangent here. That was a great gig. There's 3 bands on that. Oh dear, I think it was one of the last gigs I went to. Was it the last gig before COVID? Not sure. I know it was a gig in Toronto, and Deaf Heaven played. Oh damn it! Yeah, I wish I could remember, but yeah. Anyway, he's a musician. The albums are like they're referred to as the Purple Album, the Blue Album. Is it the Yellow album? And in fact, I've got. Let me just do this off screen because it's going to bug me. Blue Album. And of course, Weezer. It's not Weezer, by the way. Just in case you wonder. Oh damn it! See, it's now coming up with things like "Purple" by Stone Temple Pilots. Arr. Oh, that's really annoying. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to find this. That's a shame. But it wasn't one that I was specifically thinking about. But anyway, so yeah, it always fascinates me. I go through these, and there's like all these like side rabbit holes, and I do this. It's like, oh yeah, I recognise that artist, and yeah, wasn't that? But yeah, I do find it really interesting when you get artists that do their own artwork. So, in case in point, Stone Roses album, that was it John Squire piece of art on there, and then this other artist who has a band who I can't remember. His artwork has turned up on lots of stuff. Hang on, I know I might be able to find this because doesn't Falatak, don't they use his artwork? Baroness. I knew I'd get there in the end. So Baroness, John Dyer Baisley from Baroness. So yeah, he does artwork for a lot of albums with cover art by John. Yeah. Anyway, we've gone off with a bit of a side rabbit hole, but that's half of the fun of these. So yeah, and then the third band whose name Zeal and Ardor. Yeah. So Zeal and Ardor, Deaf Heaven, Baroness. That was an awesome lineup, and we'd never seen Zeal and Ardor before. I don't even know if we were aware of them, apart from knowing they were on the list. Anyway, back to the album. Weekend in the City. Obviously because it's here, awesome album. And you can definitely, if you like, what would you call it? Like slightly glitchy rock. It's not over the top. But there are interesting use of synth and beats and stuff like that with, guitar, really interesting guitar interplay as well. That you hear in a lot of, where are they putting this? So alternative rock, indie rock, in there. But you can hear how people sort of, that's a good word, musical jerkiness, that's in there. I was trying to stumble at the words here, but the process beats, that you were definitely hearing in UK music at the time. And I was listening not to this band, but related to this band, but something else I was listening to the other day, a podcast, and they were talking about Plundertronics, stuff like that. So would it be DJ Shadow? And I did hear, pretty sure I heard DJ Shadow mentioned in the same breath when talking about one of the main people involved with this band, where they'd drawn influences from. And other instances where people had sort of said, oh, it sounds a lot like so-and-so band, and then them to go, well, actually, we haven't really listened to that band that much. And again, Gang of Four. So that's one where, often people might have said, oh, it reminds me of Gang of Four, but the band said, well, we haven't listened to Gang of Four. But I think the problem is that bands like Gang of Four permeate a lot of indie bands, and particularly it's like UK, I suppose, post-punk, and a lot of bands that are then absorbed post-punk and Britpop and other hip-hop stuff as well, and sort of angular sounds of bands like Public Image Limited, and was it Keith Levine type guitar playing, angular guitar, I think I referred to it as well. So but the other thing is that the lyrics are quite challenging as well, so that's the only warning that comes with this as well, because some people don't always like to listen to darker stuff, but I don't have a problem with that, and I found it really actually a pretty enjoyable listen, and some pretty, again, UK based band talking about their own concerns in the UK in 2007. It's pretty interesting listening to that as well. So to sort of dive in and do that. Let's just see where this was. So Strainer number 2. Obviously, are we 2007? I think we're before streaming was being counted, or were they? I don't know. I can't remember if they must have been. Oh yeah, my mind's a bit fuzzy on when did the iPod become a thing? 2001. So I'm assuming what online purchases were counting it to the UK chart. I suppose I could fact check as I go along, couldn't I? That might do that. Electronic age. Okay. I'm just bringing this up off, so I'm not confusing the screen here. Okay, inclusion criteria. So I'm wondering when audio downloads started to get included. So 2004, legal downloading was initially small with My Coke Music. Okay. First significant download retailer in 2004. Okay, in 2005, the BBC Radio 1 chart show was rebranded for the chart week ending 16th of April, with the first singles chart now combining physical release sales and legal downloads. So yeah. Okay, so yeah, so we are in an era here, 2007, of downloads as well. Interesting. So this album had also been leaked as well. So straight in at number 2. So that's pretty good. And then, slow motion out. So what have we got that week on the album charts? So Mika, Fall Out Boy, Nora Jones. Oh, yeah. Now this, I think, didn't Back to Black by Amy Winehouse come out the previous year. I do have this on vinyl, but I always get confused about the year it was released. But I'm pretty sure 2006. So yeah, previous year. Thought so. Looks like we've got Klaxon's Snow Patrol. Yeah, I do remember that album. That was a funny one. That album I was aware of, but I didn't listen to and buy until 2010. Yeah, so that had come out the previous year. So of course there's a lot of stuff that's just sitting on the charts here, and we'll look and see more immediate stuff that was coming out that year, and I'll talk a little bit about obviously what I was primarily listening to, and I'll uncover that as we go through the slicing on here. I've not, and week to week I'll change the slicings on things simply because I know for a fact that I probably wasn't listening to much music from a particular genre, so it's pretty pointless me going through and saying, well, I wasn't listening to any of that. Which happened, I think, last week a little bit with one particular genre. So, Keen, yeah, I do remember them at the time. So they had a certain, that's another, I think I've listened to one of their albums, and again, after the fact, probably Hopes and Fears. So, yeah, and Stop the Clock by Oasis, Kasabian Empire. Yeah, I'm not sure what category quite to put Keen into. We've got a lot of bands kicking around that are clearly influenced by, Britpop in some capacity or post-Britpop. But then we've also got stuff like Sam's Town by The Killers. And that again, I'm quickly looking this up to see when that actually did get released. 2006, yeah, so obviously there's a few albums here from the previous year. Black Parade, My Chemical Romance. Pink had an album out in the charts. Kooks. Yeah, a lot of these bands I recognise, but there's going to be an awful lot of bands here that I'm going to be talking about, I think, where they fall into that category on the quadrant of aware of but didn't listen to. And yeah, as I come through this, but also this week has been a lot of album bands that I was completely not aware of, didn't listen to, and then suddenly have listened to, of which one was Bloc Party. So I'll include links to a little bit more about the band if you're interested in digging deeper there. Timeline wise, it's always interesting to see like who are the core members of the band. Looks like, ooh, it's interesting that suddenly stops. Has there been it doesn't mention whether the band is still going. it says present. So I'm assuming there's either a glitch, or maybe it's just the way these are. They don't go all the way up to the end. Yeah, maybe it's just the way the graph is. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, two main members of the band. You can see lead vocals, rhythm guitar, and then lead guitarist. But you can see latterly we've got some keyboard, synthesizer, electronic shenanigans going on. So, and you can see the listing there as well. I'm assuming they were dabbling in all of that already. It's just probably it might have been more noticeable when they were either recording or playing live as to how that balance changes. It always fascinates me. I think the first band that I ever saw who I was consciously aware of, because I saw them live, like switching instruments, was The Alarm. When I saw them in 1985, that's it. Because I've seen them a couple of times, 85, and then I think again in 87. And when I first saw them, I thought, what's going on here? And like, you know, the bass player and the guitar, I think, would swap rounds. It was really curious. I'd not experienced that before. And the funniest occasion I ever saw it taken to the most extreme example of that was, and I'm sure I've mentioned this, of people swapping, but just it sounding awful, was that one Easter, that's a bank holiday weekend, so Easter Monday, I think it was, a friend of mine, again, actually I'm referencing the Shelley Arms here, who sort of managed the Shelley Arms, his dad owned it, and they put on this, someone convinced him to put on this Bad Bands of Sussex thing during the day. But what they did was it was a band composed of, I think, there was at least one punk band that lived around sort of Nutley area in Sussex, but they had a number of associates. Anyway, they did this Bad Bands of Sussex Day, but I got the impression, because I went there to see what it was like, that it was basically the same people but just swapping instruments, and maybe pulling in people. So I think on one there was a manager of one of the punk bands sung vocals, and which actually sounded pretty good. They did the first band I saw were the best sounding, and they did some Subhuman covers, which were really good actually. Having being into the Subhumans at the time, I'm talking about the UK Subhumans, not the US one. And then they all proceeded to swap instruments, but they got slowly, it sounded worse and worse, because as they moved around instruments, they were getting more incompetent on the instrument. But the one I really remember, it may have been the first band on, and they were called the Dirty Rotten Beer Mats, and they had this huge bed sheet with Dirty Rotten Beer Mats on it, and then underneath it said Toronto's Finest. And clearly I knew them, and they weren't from Toronto. But yeah, that was the other time I'd experienced like band members swapping instruments, but not for a good effect. Whereas The Alarm, they were all competent on different instruments. But yeah. Oh, number of nominations. What did they win then? I wonder, an Emmy Award for Best Album. For Silent Alarm, that was. So the actual album itself, I don't see anything mentioning about that. But yeah, clearly they've been, looks like they've been popular. Often in the UK, you get, when you have these like yearly best ofs that are specific to either UK organisations or publications, there are some bands that seemingly get nominated every year, but never win. Or they always seem to come up all the time. Like I remember there was one band in particular that seemed to have a really good run on that, and I just noticed their name was coming up every year. Was it Muse? I think that happened to quite a bit, where they'd always be on there, and I can never remember whether they won quite a bit or not. But it always makes me think of that when I think about these UK awards. There seems to be several bands that just seem to come up year in, year out. And of course, these 13 nominations were spread out over multiple different awards over maybe a tighter period of time. It looks like, from what dates they're mentioning, it looks like they're, in terms of nominations, the time in the Sun was 2005 through to 2008, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, so let's try and get a feel for what really caused me to be blindsided by the band, and why I wasn't listening to them. So I'm going to go through just rock album releases and try and flag up some stuff. So it was interesting this week. There were a number of albums that I was purely focusing on the UK scene. So as I look at this here, that Radiohead, I think it ends up like number one, regardless of the country, as number one album on the best ever albums listing. So I definitely listened to that. I have listened to that previously. Arctic Monkeys, I've hardly listened to any of their stuff, and I listened to that for the first time, I think, this week. Arcade Fire. I think, yeah, I did listen to that at some point as well. I think I did a cursory run through just generally of stuff from 2007 that I hadn't listened to, regardless of falling into categories. So this is a Canadian band, so they wouldn't have been in my UK filter, but yeah, I definitely had to listen to this album. So and The National as well. So I may be thinking about this, trying to remember with The National, what's their country of origin, because they're a band that I've not listened to a great deal. Yeah, American band. But I think what happened was, as a precursor to listening to just UK exclusive bands from 2007 that were high up on best ever albums, I think I gave a cursory listen to some of the higher stuff just generally. And so I did end up listening to Radiohead, Arctic Monkeys, Arcade Fire, The National. It's funny, I didn't buy this Queens of the Stone Age album at the time, even though I was into them. And I've listened to this a couple of times now. This is a really cool album. And the guy involved with this band, and I'm going to have to look up his name because I'm going to get it wrong. Stephen Wilson does a really interesting podcast called The Album Years. So another one that really I've only listened to. I think I first listened to this in the last year. Okay, Avril Lavigne. Now, one of these albums, I remember my youngest brother was playing incessantly. And I don't know if it was this album or not. And I remember also, so that's 3 albums in. I remember it getting played a lot on the radio. I'm trying to remember what that's actually got on it. Girlfriend. Best Damn Thing, no. Maybe not. But wasn't there also a Pink album out this year? I'm not sure. We'll probably see it. So this album was one I picked up on fairly early on, but I can't remember how, because at this point I don't... we'll talk about streaming in a moment, but I heard this album through streaming. I didn't buy this album, but I became aware of Alcest fairly early on, so within about a year or two of this, I think. I think we went to see Mika maybe in 2008 on one of the trips of my soon-to-be wife visited the UK, I think, 2008, 2009. Yeah, this is a cool album that I've only just listened to recently, The Editors. And I had been aware of them, and I was aware that they had a slightly, like, you know, Joy Division early, well, yeah, Joy Division sound, I suppose. To them, so that was interesting, actually giving them a proper listen. I was trying to think. I don't think I'd listened to any of their stuff. So what are we with? Yeah, 2 albums deep by this point. I'm doing that thing off screen where I'm like rolling over the album covers and seeing if I recognise them. Yeah, no. Oh, Coheed and Cambria. Seen them, they're really cool. I must listen to that album actually. I listened to their later albums. Oh, of course, Kaiser Chiefs. I remember indirectly hearing this album at the time because they were playing a lot of stuff on the radio. And ultimately, I have listened to it. Walter Bridge, I think I've already mentioned quite a bit later. This is an interesting album, Ages of the Light. So this would be, would it be a post-Swan album? And I'm trying to remember, again, how deep in. I remember seeing, there's one with a really cool album cover. And yeah, so yeah, New Mother. Let me just try and go in, see if I can bring this up so you can see. Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. That's their first album. I really love that album. It reminds me of, like, you know, when we used to build dens on Ashdown Forest back in the day, growing up. It just makes me think of that. So this one with the puppy dog, assume that's supposed to be with a bone, would be what? We Are Him. Wow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 albums in, if you include the split they did with Akron Family. From 2005. Yeah, I don't know how many people watching my videos on music or watching my videos generally listen to Swans. I haven't listened to much of their stuff. I've got that double album, Soundtracks for the Blind, and I've listened to a few things either side of that. But Angel of the Light album, I did listen to How I Loved You, but like years later, because How I Loved You and the New Mother album I just showed you, they would, you know, came out just before 2000, just after, so straddling 2000s, and that's definitely like well pre-streaming. So like I say, apart from me, you know, buying the Swans album on CD, particularly in that time period in the 2000s, I would have been pretty selective about what I bought, just for monetary reasons. Oh, there's a Nick Cave spin-off album. I don't think I've ever listened to that. Snakes and Arrows. I've seen them live, but a few years later. When they had when I saw them, they had the washing machines as a backline. Okay. So just looking at metal generally, let's see what the hell I was listening to. Oh, okay. So yeah, I think 2007 for me was definitely, so I would have been reading Terrorizer Probably subscribed to it at that point, I reckon. Yeah, I was. But I was on a bit of a metalcore jag at that point, and so I was sort of checking out various bands, and I remember checking out In This Moment. I was doing a lot of infilling as well, and really like leveraging cheap CDs on Amazon at that point, but at the same breath being able to like infill back catalogues of certain sort of hard rock and metal bands quite considerably. And so I remember bands like Arch Enemy and Lacuna Coil like filling in their back catalogue around this time. And funnily enough, there's Rise of the Tyrant by Arch Enemy. So I definitely remember checking that out when it came out. I'd sort of lost track a bit of Paradise Lost. Oh yeah, I remember this album. And Encephalum, I saw them in 2009. So it wasn't until then that I was checking them out. And they had an album out that year. And I remember checking out Naja. So I think the two things that I suddenly, I rediscovered metalcore in its new form after being aware of Earth Crisis. And then also I really started to listen to a lot of drone. So I picked up, I think, the Earth album. I can't remember why. Like Earth 2, Low Frequency Edition or whatever it's called. And then through that became, I was already sort of aware of Sun and also Naja. And I remember listening to some Naja of that time. So, Shadows Fall, and probably, I don't know if they specifically had an album out at that point or that year, but probably maybe Hatebreed. But yeah, this album I bought when it came out. 3 Inches of Blood, Fire Up the Blades. So yeah, that's basically, I think, was my jag at the time, was a combination of drone, like whatever version of metalcore was out that year, because it just kept evolving. And then stuff like probably like a lot of sort of black and death metal, I suppose. Naglfar, Harvest. Yeah. I don't think I discovered this band at this point. That didn't come until later when a friend was asking me about them after I moved to Canada, because they were having trouble getting hold of their stuff. So, yeah. Oh, punk. Yeah, I didn't really listen to this album at the time. Against Me. Oh, so this album, this was another thing I became aware of. So like bands that either had what's called the SID chip on, they were using. So SID chip comes from gaming. It was a sort of type of chip that was used on a lot of gaming consoles back in the day, also on some sound cards, and it was integrated into a particular synthesizer. And so I don't know how, I think it was one of those lucky accidents, but I became aware of Nintendo Core. I think I was playing around with genre mashups and going, what if you took Nintendo and added Core on? Yeah, like I think because I was into metalcore, I was adding on Core on the end of everything. So that's how I discovered things like deathcore and every other core. And so I put Core on the end of Nintendo and ended up with a whole load of bands like Enter Shakira, Horse the Band. I think there's a band called Power Glove who do metal renditions of music from that sort of stuff. So yeah, that was interesting to do that, to take a look at that. So what else have we got here? I think most of this stuff I didn't listen to at the time. There's plenty to listen to if I choose to go down some other genre rabbit holes for 2007. If we look at the electronic stuff, so I did see a few here. They're definitely, so I remember, yeah, so stuff like this I remember listening to at the time, certainly this, and I remember this album being mentioned. Like, I don't know if I've ever listened to it. So this is an electronic slice. Oh yeah, I do remember this, but I was a number of years before I had a really good listen to the Shadows of the Sun. I'd done a little bit of infilling with older stuff, some of their earlier stuff. So I think the first album I bought by them, they'd already gone quite sort of trip hoppy. There was that Marriage of Heaven and Hell album that they did, and they were slowly sort of moving away from their original sort of black metal roots into more trip hop and then soundtrack style like stuff. This is a super mellow album. It's really cool actually. But I do remember buying a couple of the earlier things like their debut album, but then not picking up on this until quite a bit later. I don't recognise anything else here that I listened to at the time. It's probably another area where there could be some good infilling. Definitely going to have to spend a bit of time in my spreadsheet looking at stuff that I did miss out on 2007. And then we get pop stuff. Now I think I recognise a few things here, but I don't think I was listening to much pop at the time, or really sort of tuned into it. Yeah, I remember this album being big, but I didn't really listen to any KT Tunstall. Oh, it's another Melanie C album. Don't remember listening to that at all. Yeah. I tend to really just stick with the first page on this because this is the most common albums rather than going too deep. So what I'll do is I'll include a link to there's quite an interesting this is a website thing I've recommended before, Trash Theory. So there's a good one on under the sort of new British Canon series they've been doing, and yeah, there's one on Bloc Party. So I will include that so you can check it out. Also, yeah, I just want to make a point, mention this again, because at the time I was reading a lot of Terrorizer. So yeah, during that period, most of the stuff that would have been in the category of aware of and did listen to, or just generally aware of, would have been as a result of reading this magazine, really. And the other thing where at the time I was getting my music discovery from was this. So I was an early user of Mog, which is, I believe, no longer around. When I was using it, it was still very much a blogging network, and then over time it moved over to an online music service. So it started in 2005. I started using it in 2006. So by 2007, I was blogging a lot on here. The nice thing about it, what I liked, is that there was a sort of pseudo HTML thing which allows you to embed stuff quite easily, like YouTube into it and various other music snippets. So it was great if you were sort of chatting about or blogging about music and you wanted to include examples. So I remember I used to get up really early in the morning before I went out to visit clients, and I'd like blog or just put together blog posts for like an hour or so over breakfast. And so that, when I think about 2007 and music discovery, this is where also I was talking about music, learning about music. I remember then talking a lot about, probably during this period, a lot about drone and stuff like that, because there were a few people on the platform that were big into drone doom and other things as well. And yeah, Spotify was in its infancy, although if you look at the timeline, it claims 2010 was when open public registration officially opened for the free tier. I was using it before then because of this invitation only policy, and I'm sure that was 2007 into 2008, I reckon. So if I wasn't using it in 2007, I was certainly on the cusp of using that in 2008 and into 2009 and the free stream. And I know for sure I was using it before 2010 because by then I'd moved to Canada and I had already been using Spotify and actually had to alter my membership, I think, to make it work in different places. And I already had a paid for membership, I think, so then it would work overseas because I was, coming backwards and forwards between Nova Scotia and the UK from 2008 into 2009. But the other things I used a lot back then was this one, Deezer, and I think I discovered Deezer before I discovered Spotify. So that was a is a music streaming service. So I was using that a lot for music discovery. And there was other things like Pandora. In the early days of Pandora, there was a free thing for a while, like an ad-supported version, which I used to use. And I'd sort of set up, that just to play music and then through that discover music. And then finally, and I think I've mentioned this already, there were a number of sort of MP3 searching utilities and other things. And Screamer, I remember using it to just like turn up music online, finding it. It's not, I'm pretty sure it no longer exists. This is a post from 2007, I believe, somewhere around there, yeah. And I stumbled across Screamer and started using that. I've actually got one of the Screamer t-shirts with the bat on it from way back. I still have that. So yeah, 2007, a very interesting year. And it was cool to sort of listen through, and like I said, I created this little Spotify with a sort of ecosystem of UK artists. And that's really how I stumbled across this and spent most of this week listening to this album on and off, actually. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I'll catch you in a future episode.